What is dead may never die. Undead Priest. I've got the list here that I prefer to play. I played this quite a bit on my Legend climb for this month. If you're able to put this deck together, you have the cards, then I would say definitely give it a whirl. You're going to be able to win a lot of games and gain ranks. I would say, though, if you don't have these cards, don't necessarily craft them. Some of these cards are going to rotate when the core set rotates in April. Things like Benedictus and Void Touched Attendant. The deck could still be a thing, but it may not be, so I just wanted to throw that warning out. The deck is actually a little bit more complicated than you would assume just by looking at it. I know a lot of people kind of look down on aggro decks and think that they're low skill, but they're actually not, and especially this deck. And some of the ways that you can find little edges is by understanding the cards and the best ways to be able to play them. So I want to take a trip through the cards that are in the deck, talk about their uses and why they're in the deck. Right off the bat, we have the Undying Allies here. This card is the definition of value. For 0 mana, after you play an undead this turn, give it Reborn. Common mistakes that I see people make with this card is they want to try to get too much value out of it. Typically, if you have this card in your hand, along with like a Haunting Nightmare or a Shadowed Spirit, you can play the Undying Allies and just get one of these with the Reborn attribute, and that's going to be plenty. If you can hit 2 minions with it, maybe you want to set it up, but you don't want to hold on to this card too long. Certainly, I would consider one of the power plays of the deck would be to play an Undying Allies with a Haunting Nightmare on turn 3. Even though it's only 1 minion, it just ends up being really powerful. You're going to have to keep in mind with the Undying Allies, though, depending on the matchup and whatever your opponent's health total is, if you're looking to find damage to kill your opponent in the next 1 to 2 turns, you're probably strongly going to want to consider using it on a Shadowed Spirit. And then, of course, the later the game goes in the higher turns, potentially you could use it on 2/3 drops, for example, on turn 6 or turn 5 with the coin. But the important thing here is you don't want to save the Undying Allies to try to hit multiple minions. Hitting just 1 minion is plenty. Also, keep in mind, too, with the Undying Allies, in certain games, you're going to find that your hand actually does nothing. For example, maybe you've drawn 2 copies of Shadow Word Undeath, and you have a Shadow Cloth Needle, and you have a location in your hand just really isn't doing anything. If, by some miracle, you're able to get an Undying Allies along with a Mind Eater, I'll actually throw down the Undying Allies with the Mind Eater. Adding a copy from our opponent's deck to our hand can sometimes give us the resources to be able to compete in that game. So it's almost like a way to be able to fight against having a bad draw when we're up against, just a tough opponent or a tough matchup. If we don't hit the minions early that we really want, that can be a way that we can maybe claw our way to stay in the game. And then as we start to find the cards that we want, potentially be able to pull out a win in those games. Moving on to Animate Dead here. Again, this is just all kinds of value. 1 mana, resurrect a friendly minion that costs 3 or less. We have the minions that are included in the deck. Keeping in mind, they can hit Void Touched Attendant, which would just be a lot of damage that could be coming out with the different ways we have to be able to damage our opponent. Astalor, we don't ever want to revive this, but just getting a 2/2 for only 1 mana could be pretty good. Incorporeal Corporal could be a good minion to revive just because it can probably punch face for 5. And then, of course, the Mind Eater, we're going to get a little extra value by adding a card from our opponent's deck to our hand. And then hitting these 3 drops can be really good, again, because they have death rattles that could come off the Animate Dead. So early in the game, you're going to have a really strong idea about what the Animate Dead is going to bring back. For example, if the only thing that's died is a Haunting Nightmare, then you know if you play the Animate Dead, you're going to be able to get that Haunting Nightmare back. It's just really good value for only 1 mana. And keep in mind that both of these are shadow spells, so they're going to work well with the Shadow Cloth Needle here. And it's really just a good way to be able to develop tempo early. So Animate Dead, definitely don't underestimate it. Keep in mind also, though, the 4/3 that's generated from the Death Rattle on the Haunting Nightmare is also going to be a 3 mana minion. So it's possible that you could revive just a regular 4/3 with no text on the card whatsoever. Always important to remember what those outcomes might be able to be while you're playing. Mindseer gives us the ability to be able to remove a minion from our opponent's side of the board and get some damage face here. 3 damage face, nothing to sneeze at. Keeping in mind that when combined with the Void Touched Attendant, that would be 4 or 5 if both Void Touched Attendants are on the board. Sometimes you're going to want to keep in mind that you might be able to find a little bit of a sneaky lethal by using this on a minion on your own side of the board. So if our opponent has no minions on the board whatsoever, or if all of their minions have more than 2 health, then we won't be able to get the damage to the hero's face. But maybe we kill the minions on our side of the board just to be able to get that damage face. So definitely some good damage here. Could be removal, and then could be a way to be able to find lethal. Shadowcloth Needle here, of course, this just adds damage to the board as well as our opponent's face whenever we play a shadow spell. So it can be good against decks that are going to be playing low health minions, and you could play like an Animate Dead and a Mind Seer, and then you'll be able to just totally clear your opponent's side of the board. Definitely strong, and not to be sneezed at, that this damage is also actually hitting our opponent in the face, and if we have the Void Touched Attendant on the board, instead of just dealing 1 to the opponent's face, it's actually going to deal 2. So Shadowcloth Needle, Void Touched Attendant, plus 3 shadow spells, that's actually going to be 6 damage to our opponent's face, plus whatever damage may be generated off, say, like the Mind Seer that we may have played that turn. So important to keep in mind that we're actually getting extra damage when combined with the Void Touched Attendant. Attendant itself, really a mainstay in Shadow Priest, which is really what Undead Priest is. It's just the latest version of Shadow Priest. We're able to generate extra damage here. If we're going first, playing this on turn 1 is going to be fine. If we're going second and you find this in your hand, you may actually want to save it to try to just get just a little bit more value and be able to play it when we have multiple sources of damage. So, you know, even if that's just like 1 minion and a hero power or 1 minion and a Mind Seer, if we play this when we're going second, then potentially we play this out, our opponent kills it, and we die. Also important to keep in mind here that this card actually affects our face as well. You don't want to play this out against an aggressive deck that already has the board, because now you've enabled your opponent to deal a lot more damage. They can just ignore our board and start punching face and either kill us or set our health really low to the point that basically we just threw the game. So you do have to be careful depending on the board state. We don't want to give our opponent a lot of extra damage, but if we have initiative and we have board, this is a way for us to be able to create extra damage. Keeping in mind as well, the Void Touched Attendant also works with the Shadow Word Undeath. If this hits face twice, that's going to be 6 damage instead of just 4, so it would be 3 and 3 to the opponent's face only if that Void Touched Attendant is on the board. So again, just being able to track our damage and being able to set up these lethals that may not be, you know, absolutely obvious in the moment. Whispers of the Deep, the silence here. Mostly in the deck, you're only going to have 2 targets that you're going to want to hit with the Whispers of the Deep. That's going to be the Najak Hexen, as you can see here. We'll talk more about that, as well as the Incorporeal Corporal. So one of the early game high rolls is going to be Whispers of the Deep on the Corporal. I'm sure you've probably seen this combo. You play the Corporal, you then silence it. It's going to deal 5 damage to the board. And now you have a 5/5 that can punch your opponent in the face every single turn. Really, really strong in an aggro deck, and depending on the matchup you might find yourself in, sometimes just having that 5/5 early punching face every turn, this minion can actually just solo your opponent in certain matchups and certain situations, but definitely a power play in the deck. Outside of that, it has somewhat limited uses. We don't necessarily want to silence our Death Rattle minions, although it could be a good play if we need that damage to clear the board, if we're in that bad of a spot. Or sometimes you might want to silence, for example, a Mind Eater. If this has been buffed by the location and it has 3 health, maybe we attack with it first to be able to get maximum damage and then silence it, and then we would be able to kill it off with a Mind Seer. And then also keeping in mind that this is also a shadow spell, so it's going to be able to be used with Shadowcloth Needle to be able to get that extra damage. So a couple of uses that are maybe not so obvious, but again, just that early game power play with the Corporal and Whispers of the Deep, very, very strong. It is a little bit rare though. I've played well over 100 games with this list in particular, and I think only 1 time have I actually had the Incorporeal Corporal and Whispers of the Deep in the early game like that. So a little bit rare, but definitely something that we want to keep in mind. Astalor included in the deck, it's just a really good card. It's basically a win condition on its own. It allows us a little extra damage, a little extra healing in the form of gaining armor. Then, of course, if we get down the 8 mana version, turn 10 and above, it's just a lot of damage that could potentially be able to close out games. So Astalor, I think, really speaks for itself. It's pretty much included in a lot of decks these days. Mind Eater, I touched on briefly. If you have this on turn 2, you just throw it on the board. It's going to get us a little bit of value if that Death Rattle goes off. Getting a deck or a card from our opponent's deck can give you a little bit of information about a card that's in the deck versus what your opponent may have in their hand. Although keeping in mind that a lot of cards, they could have 2 copies, so the second copy could be in their hand. But just a way to be able to generate extra resources for our own hand. It's an undead, so it's going to combo with our Shadow Word Undeath, as well as the High Cultist Basilisk, which we'll talk about a little bit more later. But it's just a really solid addition in this list, and you know, no shame whatsoever in throwing it down on turn 2. It's actually a really good play. 2 copies of Location also included in the deck. This is probably my least favorite card in the deck. I've tried cutting these for other things and haven't really found a good replacement, but pretty much with the Location in hand, I never want it in hand. I almost always would rather have a different card out of my deck. And I find that it's better to, on turn 3, be playing minions rather than playing the location, even if we have a minion on the board to be able to buff with. So sometimes you have it, and drawing cards can be good, or buffing a minion can be good, but I find that most of the time I actually just don't want to play this card. So included in the deck, it does get a spot. It is going to have spot uses, but I think a lot of times we're going to be able to find a better play than just playing the location, unless we specifically just need to draw a card. Although there could be ways to be able to set up lethal with the 2 damage that we're adding to a minion that's on the board. So again, this is kind of a play that I don't necessarily want to make, but it is going to be correct and good in certain spots. We just want to make sure that we think through our turns. Haunting Nightmare also included in the deck. This is really strong in a tempo-based deck like what we're playing here. Death Rattle goes off, it haunts a card in our hand, and then it's going to summon a 4/3 on the board. Potentially really, really good. This is a key card that we would want to use with Undying Allies in most matchups. Even again, if we only use Undying Allies on one minion and it's a Haunting Nightmare, usually it ends up being pretty good because it allows us to be able to add additional minions to our board. Shadowed Spirit, 2 copies. Death Rattle is dealing 3 damage to our opponent's face. Keeping in mind that with the Void Touch the Tenant, that Death Rattle is actually going to be dealing 4. Again, these are both undead minions, which are going to be good for Shadow Word Undeath and the High Cultist Basilisk. And also, again, you want to keep in mind that potentially using Undying Allies with Shadowed Spirit, you're going to be able to get that Death Rattle twice. Silence, not really seen a whole lot in today's meta, and sometimes that can help you be able to find the lethal damage. Overall, I think in most situations, we're probably going to be better off if we have to make a choice of only one of these, if they're both in our hand and we have an Undying Allies and not enough mana to play both. In most cases, I think the Undying Allies are going to be better off playing the Haunting Nightmare, being able to get an additional 4/3 on the board. Typically just pretty good with this deck. Do keep in mind, though, the 4/3 that's generated off the Haunting Nightmare is not actually an undead itself, which can come into play as we start getting down to these other cards that take advantage of the Undead Tribe. Grave Digging, one of the cards that takes advantage of the Undead Tribe. If an Undead dies, it's draw 2 cards for only 1 mana. That ends up being really, really strong. Most of the time, you never want to pay full cost for this. You're going to want to hold your card draw until an Undead minion dies. Sometimes, if we really need cards out of our deck, we're low on resources, or if we're trying to find lethal, it could be correct to actually trade one of our Undead minions so that it dies, and then we can play that Grave Digging for only 1 mana. So really, really good card draw here. Very rarely you'll find yourself in a spot where your hand just does nothing, and the best play is going to be actually paying 4 mana to draw 2 cards, but it's like the ultimate bummer. We don't want to do it. We only do it if we have to. So again, let's make sure that we're thinking things through as we're making these plays and setting up future turns. You may have to actually play this a turn before you would want to. Maybe you would want to spend your mana a little bit differently, but if we're not going to be able to have an undead on the board so that it can die, so that this costs 1 mana next turn, then maybe we need to draw those cards this turn. So again, you're going to want to plan out your turns in advance. Make sure you know when you're going to be able to draw cards for cheap, if you know you're going to need to get those cards out of the deck. High Cultist Basilisk card is absolutely insane. Resurrect all friendly undead that died after your last turn. That gives us options. If we have an undead on the board and our opponent kills it, that's occurred after our last turn, so we can res that back. Insanely strong. And potentially the best case could be we actually trade minions on the board, remove our opponent's board, and then resummon our board with the Basilisk while being able to take advantage of these death rattles going off. So I think one of the key things here, similar to Undying Allies, is we don't necessarily want to tunnel vision so much on getting like ultimate value. So one of the power plays in the deck, if High Cultist Basilisk actually brings back 2 minions, it's insane, and it's almost like a game-winning play. But if I played, for example, Haunting Nightmare on 3, and then my opponent kills it on their turn, I'm going to drop the High Cultist Basilisk on 4 if it's in my hand, because even just getting back 1 minion is really good. So you can think about it as, you know, we're paying 4 mana for 7 mana worth of stats that are going to be on the board, plus the Death Rattle. I mean, these Death Rattles are actually pretty strong, and the cards may even be valued at 4 mana rather than 3, but because they're priest class cards, they're costed at only 3. So High Cultist Basilisk, even just bringing back 1 is going to be really good. I would encourage you to make that play on your own as well. But then, of course, if you can get back like 2 undeads, or, you know, maybe you're able to stick a Mind Eater, your opponent doesn't remove it, this on turn 3, and then on turn 4 you can bring back the Mind Eater and the Shadowed Spirit, or Mind Eater and Haunting Nightmare, whatever the case may look like. It's just a home run play, and it's going to be really, really strong. One thing you absolutely need to know about the Najak Hexen is that when you steal a minion from your opponent, you actually want to silence the minion that you've stolen, because it's going to have more attack than the Najak itself. So you can see here the text at the bottom of the card, give this back when Najak dies. So I'm going to Whispers of the Deep, the minion taken from our opponent. That's going to give us more damage to the board. And then you can see here that text has now been removed by the silence. And I'm just going to go ahead and kill off the Najak here, just to prove to you that when the Najak dies, even if you silence the minion that you stole, our opponent doesn't get it back. Dark Bishop Benedictus. This card is just absolutely terrible. It does make the deck go because it upgrades our hero power. You never want this card in hand, and you definitely don't want to be spending 5 mana playing this card. Anytime you draw it, it's just kind of a bummer. We don't want it. We hope it's the last card in our deck every single game. Of course, it's not always going to be, but the card's just really bad. Basically, if you draw this in the early game, it's a card that's just going to sit in your hand and do nothing, and you really just wish that it was something else. Shadow Word Undeath, of course, you know, this card, I'm sure you've seen it in action. It's a board clear. It hits your opponent in the face. It's only going to be active if an undead has died since your last turn, so keep it in mind again, the play might be we actually have to trade off one of our own undead minions on the board to be able to get this active and then play it out and be able to clear our opponent's side of the board. This is another thing I think you don't necessarily want to sit on it too long. Sometimes just being able to clear your opponent's board on turn 5 while maintaining our own board is going to be enough to be able to win the game, because by turn 5, if things are going well with this deck, we're going to be punching our opponent down, and then we're going to be a lot closer to being able to kill them. So again, we don't want to hold on to these too long to try to get maximum value. Sometimes you just play it. Sometimes even if it's only going to clear one minion, it can be good to just go ahead and deal that damage and clear the board. Keep it in mind while we're playing, as we're planning out our future turns, we're going to want to make sure that we have an undead minion on the board in some shape or form so that this will be active when we need it. And then it's just insane as far as a board clear goes. And then also, if you have the Shadowcloth Needle equipped, it's actually going to deal 5 damage to your opponent's board, so you're able to remove things in that situation, like, say, the Paladin Light Ray card, the 5/5 Taunt. You can get that out of the way, shove your minion's face, and do lots of damage to your opponent playing that. So that is the list. This is actually my preferred list, and I highly encourage you to be able to check that out if you have the cards. General mulligan for the deck, it's going to be a little bit different depending on whether you're going first or going second. If we're going first, then we're going to want to keep Void Touched Attendant. We would also keep our 2-drops, Incorporeal Corporal and Mind Eater. And then potentially also, if we have either the Void Touched Attendant or one of the 2-drops, then I would recommend that you would also keep one of the 3-drops, either Haunting Nightmare or Shadowed Spirit. But if we don't have a Void Touched Attendant or the 2-drops, then I would actually toss these 3-drops just to make sure that we find something to be able to play in the early game. One note here, if we have an Incorporeal Corporal already in hand, we would also want to keep the Whispers of the Deep just because of how strong that play is. It's going to be really rare, but if you have both in your hand, then it's going to be perfectly fine to keep those on turn 1. And pretty much we're just trying to hit the board and be able to overwhelm our opponent with that early game board presence. Going second, the mulligan's going to be just a little bit different. We are no longer going to be keeping the Void Touched Attendant. We want to focus on trying to find our 2-drops, either in Corporal and Mind Eater. Important to keep in mind, if the Corporal's in hand, we would also keep the Whispers of the Deep. And then we would also potentially wanting to be keeping our 3-drops. If you're offered 2 of these 3-drops, then it would be perfectly fine to keep 2 of them, even if it's like double Shadowed Spirit or double Haunting Nightmare, or one of each. Simply because we'll be able to coin out 1 copy on turn 2 and then the other copy on turn 3. That play tends to be pretty good and can potentially win the game. So if we were offered 2 3-drops but no 2-drops in hand, it would be perfectly fine. We would keep those 3-drops and be happy to be able to play that. On the coin, I would also recommend keeping the High Cultist Basilisk. Keeping in mind that if we're going second, we're likely going to be behind on board. Our opponent's going to have initiative, and Basilisk can be a way to really bring us back into the game. If we're playing against another aggro deck or the mirror match, for example, our opponent may actually be ignoring the minions that we're placing on the board, meaning that on turn 4, we would have the opportunity to be able to take some trades with the minions that we have on the board, and then if they die, we can bring them back with the High Cultist Basilisk. Likely you would only want to keep this if you already had a play to be able to make on, turn 2. So if we had, for example, 1 3-drop, we keep the 3-drop, we could coin that out on turn 2, and then hopefully we found something by that point to be able to play on turn 3. So If our hand was something like in the mulligan, we were offered like both copies of Shadow Word Undeath, an Animate Dead, and a Basilisk, at that point, I think we probably can't keep it because we do need to find some of the other early stuff. But if we have even just one of those other mulligan cards, then I would definitely recommend keeping the High Cultist Basilisk just because of how strong this card is going to be. That's going to do it for the God. I'm Uncorrupt. Thank you for watching and good luck out on the ladder.